welcome to the House of ZK Radio, which is a focused podcast and media channel exploring everything ZK, zero knowledge. I'm Alice, education lead at ZKM. Today I'm joined here with co-host Pavel, who's DevRel lead at ZKM, and our guest David, co-founder of zkSecurity. Thank you so much for being here today, David. We're very excited to have you.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm wondering, David, if you could first start off with a brief introduction of yourself. So maybe your story and how you got into the Web3 space and focused on ZK.
Yeah, so it's kind of a long story or short story, depending on how much details I get into. But the short version of how I got into Web3, if we want to focus on Web3 or ZK, is that probably I got into that through Bitcoin and discovering Bitcoin. I guess like a lot of us, and using Bitcoin, discovering Bitcoin, sort of getting into trapped into this kind of a cryptocurrency spiral. And then I guess it motivated me to like learn more about cryptography in general. So I guess I'm one of these people that got into cryptography through cryptocurrencies, and it's interesting because a lot of cryptographers always fought against crypto as in cryptography, but cryptocurrency got a lot of people into the field, including me. And so that's how I got into Web3 through Bitcoin and all these things, and I studied cryptography and all of these things. At some point, I got back into cryptocurrency because basically the only fun work to do in cryptography was in cryptocurrency. If you didn't really work in cryptocurrency, what you would do in cryptography was study it or become a professor or do research in academia. Or you could work on like TLS protocols or boring kind of no offense, but like a lot of very legacy kind of protocols and things like that. So that's sort of I was young, I wanted to do interesting things, so I followed where the interesting thing was. And I guess ZK was sort of one of the most interesting cryptography thing that was in the cryptocurrency / Web3 world. And so I naturally, as I got into cryptocurrency and worked on different projects, got sort of caught by the ZK thread. And so I guess I can say a bit more about that, but I think Coda Protocol, which is now Mina, was sort of the project that showcased what ZK could do to me, to not just to me, but to crypto in general. And that maybe with Zcash were sort of what attracted me to the ZK side. And here you have it.
Nice. And I like how you first start off from very broad. So you were very interested in cryptocurrencies first, and then kind of scoped into the cryptography behind there, and then ZK. So really like that kind of funnel progression. And I also think it's important to like differentiate like the two cryptos, like cryptography versus cryptocurrency, which has been a very hot kind of debate over there. Yeah, which is it? Very ambiguous. I'm wondering if you could also speak a little bit about, since you've been involved in the ZK space for quite some time now, and you also mentioned you first got your exposure through Mina. I'm wondering if you can speak about how you've seen the ZK space evolve over the years, and maybe how you would compare the space when you first started to right now, and also if you could talk a little bit about how ZK fits in the larger cryptographic landscape, just from your point of view.
Yeah, so I guess I could go way back, and like when I was in school, I studied ZK, and it was the Sigma protocols, so very simple ZK protocols to like prove the coloring of a graph, or if two graphs were isomorphic, or that you knew the discrete logarithm of some field element. And very, very specific theoretical examples that I realized nobody was using. So it was this kind of beautiful idea of you can hide the fact that you know something, and still prove to someone that you know it, and yet nobody seemed to really use it. And so that was sort of my first approach to zk. It's interesting, but I don't see anybody using it. And then as I learned more about cryptography, I realized that maybe that's the second part. Signatures are actually non-interactive zero-knowledge proofs. And so then I realized, oh, actually everybody uses zk. It's just that we only use one form of zk for the most part, which is signatures. So we're proving that we know some private key, and while we're doing this, we're also attesting to like some data, some message. And so, okay, mine is blown. Okay, actually zk is used in signatures all over the place. And then perhaps maybe Zcash was the third step in my entry into zk. And Zcash sort of showed that zk was for more than simple protocols. You could also prove circuits. I don't know technically if they were the one really showing it, but I don't know if anybody really applied that in the real world before them. So that was really interesting to see that, yeah, you can prove all sorts of programs, but specifically for them, they were proving the movement of money, right? Like transfers. I want to prove that I transferred some money from my account to your account, but without revealing actually who I am, without revealing who you are, and without revealing how much money I transferred. And so that was the third step. And I guess fourth step was maybe Mina was like sort of that's when my mind like was really blown when I learned about that, or CODA at the time, was recursive zero knowledge proofs, which is, okay, we can prove any circuits or any sort of programs, but we can also prove the verification of a proof. And now we can actually have a proof that embodies another proof, that embodies another proof, that embodies another proof, and so on. And Mina had this insane protocol that was like, okay, you don't need to verify the entirety of a blockchain, which might take, days, weeks, months, maybe even years, depending on how old the blockchain is. Instead, we're going to give you a proof that the current block is correct and that the previous proof is correct. And the previous proof is a proof that the previous block is correct and the transition is correct, and that the previous proof is correct. So that's this idea of proof recursion. And I think that's, maybe I might add step 4. Maybe that's, I can't remember, but let's say 4. And then step 5 was basically this idea of like zkVM and how efficient things are getting, and all these breakthroughs that we've seen in terms of lookups and in terms of folding and in terms of efficiencies and nowadays we basically have these protocols that are very efficient to prove and verify. People are making optimizations in terms of memory that the prover consumes, so you can prove things on your mobile phone or in your browser, and you can prove actual very very complex computations because of all sorts of breakthroughs that we've seen in, as I said, folding and recursion and these kind of things. So this one is like, this is step 5, and this step is also like another thing that you can open, and it's also like a huge box on its own, and there's a lot of things to talk about. But I would say these are the 5 sort of 5 steps that I've seen in zk since I've been studying zk and working in zk. And maybe there's a step 6, which is, you can keep improving the technology, but at some point it's not that interesting. What's interesting is what you build using it, what you build on top of it. And so maybe step 6 would be what kind of applications people are using zk for. And so far we've seen mostly applications in the blockchain space. What I'm interested in is what is it going to change in the non-blockchain space as well, and that we haven't seen too much of so far.
Yeah, I really like how you mapped out kind of like your perceptions within these 6 different stages and the progression from there. And I also really liked how you mentioned that at a certain point, once you develop the tech, it's not just about figuring out ways to tweak it, optimization, but also what you can do with it. So the applications and use cases part on that. But just on that discussion, I'm wondering what sort of use cases and applications are you personally most excited about, and even those beyond blockchain Web3?
So that's I mean, that's the question that everybody asks me. Basically, it's like, okay, you're seeing a lot of applications. What are the killer applications? What are the things that we're not working on, but we should be working on? Where's the money at? You know, all these questions. I have a startup myself, so of course I'm also trying to chase these ideas and see if I can apply some of them. And what I would say is that it's kind of difficult in most applications that you can think of, or when people pitch these kind of ideas to me, and I have to review them or decide if we want to invest in them or these kind of things. The common answer, maybe half of the time, or maybe even more, or the common question I ask people who pitch ideas to me is why aren't you just using a signature? And for most applications, a signature is just enough. You can you have these trusted parties. Everything's a protocol, right? Like you can think of Dropbox, Google, like any sort of applications or product as a protocol with multiple parties. And often you trust some of these parties. And so if you trust them, you just need to verify a signature that from them. And that's good enough. And if you, and one way I like to, I know I said that signatures are zero knowledge proofs, but we can say that, okay, you just need to use a signature, which is a zero knowledge proof, and it's simple enough. You don't need to prove more complex statements. But sometimes you do need a zero knowledge proof on a more complex statement, on a more complex circuit, on a more complex program. And one thing I've noticed is that this is so verifying a signature is enough, but sometimes verifying a signature within a circuit and then proving that you can verify a signature is actually a good use of a zero knowledge proof, of this kind of a general purpose zero knowledge proof. And so I can give some examples of applications that I've seen where verifying a signature is basically the main point of the circuit or the application, the zk application. And in that use case, it makes a lot of sense. So, so I was talking about Mina, for example. The zero knowledge proof in Mina, a lot of what it did was basically verify a bunch of signatures, which was the signature of a consensus protocol of a blockchain. A blockchain is just a bunch of people trying to come to consensus together on the state of, like, you know, all the balances and all the accounts. And so if you want to sort of accelerate the verification of all of that, you can just verify all of these signatures in a program and then give it to me, for example, and just tell me, I verified the state of the blockchain for you. I verified all of these signatures for you. Here, take the state of the blockchain, and you can trust me that this is the correct state of the blockchain because I've verified these signatures for you. So if that makes sense, that's one example. This example is really about the succinctness or the compression aspect of the zero knowledge proof. There's no privacy involved. It's just about delegating some computation. You're just asking someone to do that computation for you because you don't want to do it. It takes you too long to do it, or you're on a mobile phone. You don't want to use too much of your data. You don't want to download too much data, or you don't want to compute too much. So you delegate a computation. And a computation is specifically verifying a bunch of signatures. A second example I can give is more on a privacy example. And maybe there's like zk login and zk mail are two good examples of that, where you want to prove that you either logged in into Google or whatever SSO service you're using. So it could be Facebook, Apple, or whatever. You know, this button, login with Facebook or these kind of things. Or you want to prove that you received an email. So this is zk mail, and the first thing is zk login. And so basically the entire circuit is mainly about verifying a signature from, if we're talking about ZK login from Google, if you're logged in with Google, or if you want to prove that you received an email, you're verifying a signature from Gmail, for example. And usually you want to do that without revealing your email. And so that's why you do this in a circuit. You don't know what email I have, but you know that I have received some email, and Gmail is attesting to it because they sign on that email. So these are some of the, I guess, some of the applications that I've seen that I find very useful, and maybe I even gave like some framework to see why they're useful, and maybe see how there's more applications that are useful using the same framework.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I really appreciate you making the distinction between these two different types of use cases. Like the first one is more focused on the succinctness aspect, just if you just want to delegate a computation, whereas we can also incorporate privacy, like what you mentioned with ZK Mail and ZK Login. I think that distinction is very important. There's still quite a lot of people just in like the general audience who see ZK being equivalent to privacy, but that succinctness aspect is also something that like should also be considered. So thank you for making that distinction as well.
Yeah,
I'm wondering.
I don't know actually if you guys know about zkTLS, or if it was like one of the topics that you wanted to bring later, but maybe it's a good idea to just briefly mention it. But there's this new wave of protocols that are sometimes called zkTLS or ZK oracles. Some people call them HTTPZ. It's a funny name. And basically you're proving that you visited a website, and that the website, I don't know, you requested a page and the server replied with some response. And you can see this in my framework as well. I shouldn't say my framework. It's just a framework. But I'm fine if you want to call it the Wong framework. No, I'm just kidding. But with that framework in mind, you can see it as just another thing that's verifying a signature. And so zkTLS is basically, you want to verify a signature over some request response on like Google or your bank website or like whatever website. And most of the complexity of these protocols is often in finding who is going to produce that signature in these zkTLS protocols, because there's no such signatures in TLS or HTTPS. And so a lot of protocols are finding different ways to produce that signature. And then they use ZK to just verify that signature in a circuit, and then prove some stuff on the content of the web page. The same way ZK Mail verifies signature and then proves stuff on the content of the email, and so on.
Yeah, thanks, David. Also really good to mention about the zkTLS aspect as well. I feel like that's not as broadly talked about, but something that's very, I think, applicable in the future.
And just to follow up, so in zkTLS, how would it differ from, I guess, the regular TLS? Like, in which use cases would you implement it as opposed to going with regular?
So the problem with TLS is that there's no, or the vanilla protocol in TLS doesn't sign anything. So when you make a request, you don't sign it. When the server responds, they don't sign it. And so if there's no signature, then you can't really move that data on chain, or like in a different context. There's no way to verify the authenticity of the data. And so I guess in the context of blockchain, which is just one scenario, without signatures, you can't do anything. And so you have, like Chainlink, for example, provides a lot of oracles, and a bunch of people will check some data on some website, and everybody signs it. And if enough people agree on what they saw on that website, then the protocol on chain will just take that value and trust it. The problem with or the problem that zkTLS is trying to solve is that that data is private. So you cannot ask many people to retrieve that data because it's only you as the user who can see that data. And maybe I should give an example for that. The usual example that you hear about is a credit score. So you want to prove to someone that your credit score is, a very good credit score. So 800, I think, is a very good credit score. And so you don't want to give your password, username and password, or if you take a screenshot of the website, nobody will believe you. So what you do is that you do this sort of protocol to prove that when you make that request on your bank, they respond with something that contains 800. And the request is exactly the page you would expect for requesting a credit score on a Chase, for example. And so that's where it's useful.
Got it. In the privacy context, so to secure data, bring it on chain, but not the actual data, but more or less the confirmation of that data. In this case, like the credit score being over 800, would be the value that is checked within this
Right.
ZK TLS.
Right.
Perfect.
Yeah, nice. And at the same time, not having to. Sorry. Go ahead, David.
Oh, I just thought about another example. There's also these like zk creds or zk passport type of protocols where you're just proving that your age is over like 25 or 21, I guess would be a good use case if you're in the US, because it could be 18 in a different country if you're trying to drink. And so you might want to prove that you're over 18 or 21, but you don't want to show your passport or something like that. So you would just verify a signature from the US government or something like that.
And I guess like in those two cases, they're more privacy focused. I guess in the sense of oracles and bringing off-chain data on-chain, could it also be used in that kind of context where I can essentially post data that's not like a coprocessor, essentially post data that's not on the blockchain, but then directly back in and ensure that the data was not altered in the middle.
Yeah, I guess for a lot of you see this sort of trend these days with state proofs and these protocols that. So I never know how to sort of describe these things, but I'm not the expert there. I haven't looked too much into it, but my understanding is that Ethereum, or at least if you take Ethereum, is sort of flawed in many ways, and so some things are not accessible to developers. Like there are some things that you want to do, for example, access historical data, but you cannot. And so people have come up with these things called state proofs, which allows you to access historical data within your smart contract, within your own program. And the way you do it is that there's a lot of data. Like you get some Merkle tree of data, and you need to prove a bunch of. You need to prove that it was in the States, so that's a bunch of signatures, and then you need to prove that within that state it's somewhere. So you imagine a big tree, and so you need to prove a lot of hashes, and so usually you want to use zero-knowledge proof just to reduce the cost of verifying this whole thing. In the same way, you see these being used for light clients. So sometimes you want to. I gave the example with Mina, and you can think of that as a light client or a verifiable light client. Celo, I think Celo was the first to really play with that with something called Plumo. But basically, instead of verifying the whole, you want to like synchronize to the blockchain, and instead of verifying every block one by one, what you're going to do is verify zero-knowledge proof, which is going to be a succession of state transition, which can be proven using signatures. And this is not only useful for you, the user of the blockchain, who want to synchronize to the blockchain, but it's also useful for bridges. So for example, you might want to create a bridge from one blockchain to another. And to do that, you're basically just going to implement a verifiable light client as a program on a blockchain. And so it will continuously verify a proof of the latest state. And this gives you usually a digest over the entire state or the latest state of that blockchain. And so that's another light client. It's useful for light clients, but also for bridges. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, David, if you could also speak about your perspective on the barriers that are currently preventing these types of use cases, like what we just discussed, and also like zkTLS, zk Passport, other use cases in your Wong framework. But yeah, we're just wondering if you could speak about some of the current challenges that are existing that are preventing these use cases from becoming more widely adopted, from becoming more mainstream. I mean, we talked about in the beginning how we've already seen a lot of progress. So you mentioned about proof recursion, about the folding schemes, a lot of different kind of approaches to help contribute to greater efficiency, greater scalability. But there's still quite a lot of improvements to be made. So I'm wondering, in your perspective, what kinds of challenges should be currently exist and which ones you believe should be prioritized on to help for wider adoption?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I guess for a long time, we were sort of in the, ZK is not fast enough kind of realm. And I think we got better and better at that. And there was also ZK is not user friendly enough or developer friendly enough. And then we started having these ZK VMs. And so you can compile your Rust code and you don't have to learn anything. You can just write some Rust. And then you can just prove that. And so I would say we're still improving on these things. We're not there yet. But we've made a lot of significant breakthroughs and things are getting better and better. And so I'm pretty optimistic there. There's another thing, which is client-side proving, which is that a lot of these proofs are pretty heavy to compute. And so we see a number of services that really rely on these proofs using servers that you can delegate your proofs to. So for example, Alio just launched a few days ago. And if you use the wallet, they ask you, do you want to compute it on your side, or do you want to delegate your proofs to a server, which is much faster? The Sway cryptocurrency has the zk login protocol, and they also will have users delegate their proofs because it's faster and it's a better user experience. I believe Aptos has a similar protocol called keyless, and they also, I believe, let users delegate their proofs. And so there's a real use case to have users generate their own proofs because, privacy is always a user-centric application or product. And so this dimension of making provers more efficient in terms of memory, in terms of time, so that it can run in browsers or on mobile phones or on small laptops and so on, is I think one of the best area of research that we're going to see next. And I think hardware acceleration and all these things might actually take an interesting approach to helping there. And so these three are pretty interesting by themselves. Maybe I can add also the security aspect of it because I'm a security practitioner. I have a startup called zkSecurity, so I have to talk about that. But especially today, it's interesting because Argument, the company Argument, just released a blog post on a recent bug in a LLVM that happened that could have been devastating for any RISC-V zkVM. And so if I remember correctly, their point, you can read the blog post, by the way, it's a very good blog post. But their point was that there's a lot of bugs in compilers. There's many, many bugs that happen every day, basically. And these bugs usually are pretty benign. They're optimization bugs. But in the context of proving things in zk, you might not realize that these bugs exist right away, and they might translate in pretty devastating bugs. And so with all of these new zkVM stuff, we have to think of compilers as, they belong to what we call the TCB, the Trusted Computing Base, or another way to see it is that they're part of your threat model. They're part of the attack vectors that attackers can take. You should pay attention to them because they might be a source of bugs. It's not just your zkVM that might be a source of great source of bugs. It's also the compilers that people use to compile their Rust code to these instructions that you can prove in zk. And so we're used to seeing very big bugs in Solidity and Ethereum, and millions of dollars have been lost because someone exploited something. I think we haven't really seen that yet in zk. And maybe the reason is that zk is complex and bugs stay dormant for quite a long time. We've seen that with Zcash, for example. That had a bug that stayed dormant for like a year. That was pretty impactful if someone had exploited it. And so it's not really a barrier. Like, I think your question was more about a barrier to entry, but I think it's something that that is going to pose a lot of problems. And just to go back to the barrier of entry, I think maybe as a reminder, zk is still very, very much bleeding edge cryptography, and most institutions, most companies don't really use bleeding edge cryptography. We see it used in cryptocurrencies because cryptocurrency itself is a bleeding edge field, but it's not for everyone. And some people, for example, banks, will wait for quite some time for a technology to mature and get more secure before using it. So that's another barrier.
Yeah, I see. And on the topic of just about bugs, I'm wondering if you could speak about some of the considerations that developers, projects in general, should keep in mind when building their applications to avoid some common pitfalls or common bugs. Like you mentioned, for example, with zkVMs, some of the bugs that come in there are especially through compilers, but I'm wondering if there's also like any specific tendencies or common patterns that you've seen while you were doing your audits.
Yeah, so for zkVM, the problem is that, or the good news for the users is that it's harder to write bugs because you're not dealing with, you're one abstraction away from the actual zk. If you're writing circuits directly, then you can write bugs by producing code that actually doesn't get constrained in zk. So there's this danger. I haven't really seen people talking about it in this way, but maybe I'll talk about it in this way, where you're writing circuit code, so code that will translate into a circuit. And this is very similar to when you write circuits using Verilog and like these tools that you can use to write like hardware circuits, like real circuits, not zk circuits. You're writing, let's say, in circuit code, like things are gonna get circuitified, but you're usually mixing that with out of circuit code, like code that is not going to be part of the circuits. And that code is mostly gonna be executed by the prover. It's you can see it as a suggestion of what you should run as the prover, but you don't have to do it. You don't have to take that suggestion as the prover. And so this is where it gets dangerous. People will write code, and this out-of-circuit code is just suggestions, and so your code will run fine. And so you think it works, and a lot of developers will just think it works, and so it's secure, it's fine, you can ship it. But actually, since it's just a suggestion, the provers can cheat, and then you have bugs. And so that's basically the main source of bugs, is that usually comes from this code that works but doesn't translate into a circuit. And I guess just to go back to what I was saying about zkVMs, fortunately it's less prone to errors, human errors or developer errors. But unfortunately, most of the bugs are going to come from these abstraction layers. And so, as I was saying, from the compiler or the zkVM code itself, which is the circuit that you would normally find.
Yeah, got it. And just on this topic of adding those abstraction layers, just in general, with the emergence of using these alternative methods, so for example, zkVMs, adding that abstraction layer, or using proving languages instead of just writing the circuit directly. Do you foresee any of these approaches becoming more dominant in terms of development in the next couple of years, or do you see maybe a combination of these approaches being used, like in terms of writing the circuit directly versus adding some abstraction layers on top? And I'm wondering if you could also talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages between those approaches, or maybe some trade-offs to consider.
Yeah, so I guess that's a great question. I think that's the questions on everybody's mind, or a lot of people have been asking that question recently, especially as most of the big projects in recent years have been zkVMs or zkVMs and so on. From what different people might have different opinions. From a security perspective, I really like the idea of a zkVM because it creates this abstraction that's easier to use and safer to use for users. But you have this trade-off. The bugs are still here. They're just moving elsewhere. You're also paying a cost, of course. Like, you're always going to be more performant if you can, do the circuits yourself and optimize that at the, let's say, bare metal level. And so there's sort of a trade-off there. That being said, usually what you write in circuits, because you're writing directly to circuits, has to be smaller, and you're not going to be able to write quite complex programs if you're writing circuits directly, and so there's another trade-off there. And now that these zkVMs are getting more and more performant, you might get to the point where, exactly like with the non-zk world, when you're writing something on your computer today, nobody would reach out for assembly code, or nobody would reach out for plain, like these like intermediate layers or intermediate representations. If you want to write something today, you're just going to use Python or JavaScript, or if you really want to be performant, you're going to go and use Rust or C or something like that, because we reach a point where it's good enough. Or the optimizations that compilers are able to make are going to blow away anything we can try to craft by hand using assembly. But interestingly, even in today's not the non-zk world, you still see assembly code, or you still see things that are optimized at the circuit level. So if you think of cryptographic algorithms, for example, they're pretty heavy to run. You'll either see them optimized at the hardware level, so circuits specifically made for AES, for encryption, for example, or for SHA-256 for hashing. And so these are basically people optimizing by hand these circuits. Or you'll see, if you look at OpenSSL, for example, which is a popular library for TLS, you'll see that they use a lot of assembly, handcrafted assembly or generated assembly to speed up some algorithms. And so the same thing is happening in zk, where you see this idea of precompiles in zkVMs, where some of the operations are optimized in circuits and made available as like these sort of built-ins to higher level languages, so that they're not touched by compilers, and you can think of them as intrinsics, for example, which are usually functions that you can call in higher level languages and that will directly access the low level, and they're basically not abstracted. They're pure. They're implemented purely at the circuit level, and they're very, very fast. And you're sort of breaking the abstraction barrier when you're using them. And so basically, this is why zkVMs today are quite fast. It's because they're filled with these precompiles, but they're more or less hard to use. So that's kind of the caveats.
Yeah, I see. And I really like that comparison you made for the abstraction levels with what we've seen in, say, like assembly. And then, well, nowadays, a lot of developers prefer using those higher level languages. But at the same time, we'll still see some applications written in assembly. We'll still see, as you say, like for circuits that are optimized at the hardware level. So it's, yeah, in like my perspective, it's not just one approach replacing the others, just depending on the case, then using one approach or another could be beneficial in that specific application, but it's not really something that's totally replaceable. So yeah, thank you for bringing those points up, David. I'm wondering just, oh yeah, go
Also,
ahead, Pablo.
yeah, follow-up question. Is there, are you familiar with any libraries for common circuits that can just be plugged in for example, the SHA-256 hash or other different types of that? Do you know if anything like that exists?
So if we're thinking of the circuit, like running circuits directly, then these libraries exist. Like circumlib is the standard library of Circum, has these kind of functions. ArcWorks, R1CS has a bunch of basically what we call gadgets, but they're really just functions that implement these things that you can reuse. I guess it depends on the framework you're using. If you're talking about zk VMs, it would also depend on the basically every zk VM will have its own set of precompiles. And so depending on the zk VM you're targeting, you will have to use their precompiles. And so that comes with if you use RISC-0, you have to use their precompiles. If you use SP1, you have to use theirs, and so on.
So there isn't a way to create, I guess well, I guess like for some apps like common circuits, and then just reuse that in terms of not having to re-audit them and re check them for any security flaws. Just curious
Mm-hmm.
to know if there's a way to make things a bit safer in the ZK space rather than potentially having like lingering bugs over the course.
Yeah, I think I mean, everybody's always wondering the same after they've looked at 2 or 3 implementations of the same thing. And I think it's the same problem that already existed, like in the non-ZK world, where you have people re-implementing the same thing over and over, either in different languages or in the same language. And that's, one can say it's a source of bug, like we're duplicating work, duplicating effort. But somebody else could say we need separate implementations because if there's a bug in one implementation, at least not everything gets compromised because we have a diversity of implementations. So maybe that's another thing to think about there. But yeah, if you want to like support different, let's think about it from like you're a library maintainer, and you want to be able to support multiple zk VMs. Let's say you're gonna run into the same issue as supporting different types of CPUs, where some CPUs might support different SIMD features or these CPU features, or you want to support Intel and AMD and so on. So usually you have to sort of duplicate code for different frameworks or or lower layers, I'd say.
No, that makes sense. Essentially, it doesn't it doesn't fit into place as for example things with like higher abstraction where you can build for example smart contracts that can be redeployed on multiple different chains, and they're from a reputable like Open
Right.
Zeppelin, for example, contracts where you can just do that. You can't do the same thing with these circuits where they're custom built for a specific implementation. But good to know
Yeah.
in terms of
You
the.
could to
Mhm.
I mean, you could to some extent. I mean, that's why standards are here. Usually, in any sort of field, you have the bleeding edge is just people creating all sorts of frameworks and ways to do things and so on. And usually, you have another wave that comes much later of people that are very frustrated by all of the ways to do things and by these kind of issues, and they will create the standards. And basically everything that we use today that's been here for years and years and years and decades are standards. Like most things that we're using are standards. I mean, unless we don't care about interoperability, but if you care about that, if you care about interop, then you're most likely using standards. So I would assume that zk is going to see standards, but things are moving too fast to even think about that right now. Same as AI, I don't think there's any standards there, or people are sort of coming up with common ways of expressing models and these kind of things. But these standards are still new and moving. And then there's this zkSecurity comic of like, how many standards do we need? And then you get into the problem of having too many standards and just looking for the one.
Yeah, and just curious, David, I'm wondering, are there any sort of bug vulnerabilities that come with, like in terms of the verification process, with verifying your proofs when you're deploying a contract, as opposed to some other projects, instead of like deploying their contract on, say, Ethereum, they use a verification layer instead. I'm wondering if there's any sort of bug vulnerabilities that come with one approach versus another in terms of the verification process.
So do you mean you mentioned verification layers, but so do you mean specifically using zk versus not using zk, or do you mean something else?
Specifically for zk. Yep. Like when you have your proof and then you want to verify it on some sort of like verification layer like, for example, I know Pablo and I had a guest with Horizon Labs the other week. They were a verification layer where they were focused on like specifically those verification of those zk proofs. Mm-hmm.
So I guess let's introduce verification layers, which is a pretty new thing, and not everybody might know what it is. But there's been this new trend of I've heard of several startups, I think, aligned. I don't know if AgLayer is doing that. Hele is another one. There's Soundness. So there's been a number of these projects that basically are, I describe them as a reduction from zk to consensus. And you can think of them as basically sidechains or blockchains by themselves. Another way to talk about them is basically to call them Celestia, but for proofs. So if you're familiar with Celestia, this might mean something. Otherwise, don't listen to the example. But basically, it's a blockchain, and it's a very dumb blockchain in that it just verifies proofs. And so usually the only reason to use that is that it supports different proof systems. You don't have to, so if you want to verify a proof on Ethereum, you have to, implement a verifier and then in Solidity, right? So usually even if there's a verifier that exists for your proof system, you're going to have to re-implement it in Solidity. And then usually it's quite expensive, depending on what your proof system is, because Ethereum only has precompiles for some primitives. And so right now, what works really well on Ethereum is basically if you use pairing-based zero-knowledge proof systems, specifically with these curves like BN254 curves, then things are a little bit cheaper, still expensive. But if you want to use another proof system, then it can get very expensive. So if you use these verification layers, basically, it's almost like it's for free on this layer. It's like a blockchain where everybody's running these verifiers. They're running the actual verifier. So they're not running like a verifier written in Solidity, but they're running the code of, the Rust code of like Gross 16 or the Rust code of like some RISC-V, a zkVM or whatever. And very naively, they just verify that and they just store the fact that they verify the proof for that program with these inputs, and you produce that output. And that's all they record. And then you can have a like client. I was talking about like clients earlier. Maybe a verifiable like client that is implemented on Ethereum, if we're on Ethereum. And you just need to verify that in the state of, let's call it verification layer blockchain, VLB, as an example. In our VLB example, that has posted its latest state on Ethereum, you just need to verify that in the latest state, my proof has been verified with these inputs on this program. And that might be much cheaper because usually it's just verification of a Merkle tree. And maybe that's a proof by itself, if you want to add a ZK proof to make it cheaper there. And so that's what it provides. It provides cheaper proofs and a diversity of proof systems that you don't necessarily have on your L1, like Ethereum. Now, by doing that, there's a few issues. First, you're introducing new trust assumptions. So instead of just relying on ZK, which was, cryptography, you're relying purely on the fact that the zero-knowledge proof is correct, the zero-knowledge proof system is correct. Now you're also relying on some economic security. You're relying on the fact that there's a committee that came to consensus on these things somewhere, and they're not cheating because they didn't say, they didn't register the fact that proof verified on their chain when it didn't, because there's enough incentives and enough economic security and what's on. They believed in the token, and if they lied, the tokens would crash and they would lose their money or something. Good old L1 security. So you're introducing a new assumption. Another trade-off you're making is that you might introduce more latency or more steps in your protocol. So before you had, the user wants to use your Solidity smart contract on Ethereum. They send a proof and it's atomic. The proof gets verified on Ethereum. The action gets processed and it just works. Now, what happens is that the user tries to use something on your program in Ethereum. Now they have to post the proof on the verification layer. They have to wait for the proof to get posted back, or the fact that the proof was verified to get posted back to Ethereum. And then they need to, trigger some callback or call the smart contract again to say, hey, no, you can check. Indeed, on the verification layer, the proof has been verified. And if you follow, this is like a free step. Was there 3 steps in there? 3 steps or more steps, whereas we only had 1 step in the beginning. So that could be an issue as well. And maybe I should add also that we have aggregation layers, which are sort of a middle ground where you still pay a cost in terms of you have to wait for the aggregation layer to aggregate your proof and verify it on chain, but you don't introduce this economic security assumption. An aggregation layer is just a proof that verifies a bunch of other proofs, and it's cheaper to do that because you're verifying 100 proofs from many different applications, and you're paying the cost of verifying less than 100 proofs. Maybe sometimes even 1 proof instead of 100 proofs. And so, today it's either you verify the proof directly or you use an aggregation layer. So it's a bit cheaper, but it takes more time. And maybe you don't have as much diversity of verifiers and zero-knowledge proof systems, or you use a verification layer, and it's easier to use, it's cheaper, but you're introducing a new assumption.
Okay, got it. Yeah, thanks for making that distinction, David. I'm wondering, just also scoping out a bit on just auditing in general, could you provide us with a walkthrough of a typical process when zkSecurity provides an audit? So is there a sort of initial set of questions that you ask before performing it, any sort of procedural steps that you follow when approaching it, and like once it's complete, how do you categorize the findings? So just very curious about the steps in just performing a typical audit.
Yeah, so whenever I hear that, this question always comes from people who are not security consultants and are looking for bugs. Because once you do this kind of work, you realize that there's no secret sauce, and there's, we're basically I don't want to dumb it down, we do a very sophisticated job. But at the end of the day, we're basically reading code and doing the same thing you would have done if you were just getting started doing this kind of work, or the same thing you would have done if you were a developer trying to work on a new code base and trying to understand how to work with it and trying to implement new features on that code base. So you're really just another pair of eyes that will provide more insurance to the project or product by adding these pairs of eyes to the number of pairs of eyes that have already looked at the code. Now, we are trained pairs of eyes, so we're used to look at bugs in the code. We're also pretty good reverse engineers, so we're used to look at code and try to understand what it does. So because this is mainly what we do, and so we're relatively fast at understanding code and reverse engineering it. We've read the literature. We follow bug reports from competitors, or we follow bug reports from coworkers internally. We read about bugs that happen in the wild. So usually we're more attuned to these kind of things. And finally, we know how to use tools to perform these kind of audits more efficiently. Not to say that we always use tools, depending on time constraints and the tools that we have at our disposal. We might use fuzzing or static analysis or formal verification, or could be very dumb stuff like linters and simpler tools and so on. So it's all about, I would say it's all about having the experience of dealing with these kind of things and knowing what you can do to be more than just a pair of eyes and sort of maximize your output given the time that you have.
Got it. So it's a very like a tailored process. There's no specific set of rules, specific framework that you follow. More just like based on, say, common patterns that you've seen before, or based on like the specificities of what the project is about, then applying a more tailored approach. Okay. Yeah,
Right.
that
And
sounds great.
yeah, I guess you were also asking about findings, and I mean, there's a lot of interesting things about this process, and how we compact, we create reports, how we communicate with clients, and I would say most of it is not that interesting to most people. At the end of the day, what's interesting is like what bugs, like the most interesting things are the bugs that are found, right? Like you want to see interesting bugs. You want to see these kind of critical. We don't have criticals, actually. We have highs. We decided to not rank anything critical because it's not very nice as a developer when someone finds a critical. So we're calling them highs when we have low, medium, and highs. So that's what's interesting. What kind of bugs do we have? And the other thing that's interesting is, how did we actually find them? And I would sort of emphasize that most of the time, the good bugs are basically found by spending a lot of time staring at the screen. Maybe one day we will be able to use LLMs and AI to find bugs. And it's something actually that we're investigating, but I don't think it's going to happen today.
Yeah, I guess the halting problem is one of those things where computers verifying the that if a program would run forever I don't think a computer can do that, or like it's proven that it can't. Although program checking if another program has bugs, maybe that's we're still early.
Yeah, that makes me think of like there's a very old article. I can't remember the title. It's like who verifies the verifier or something like that. Um, and it's a very old article in formal verification. Um, that's like okay, you're formally verifying things to gain a lot of insurance, but who's verifying the code of the formal verification tools? And that if people are interested, they can search for that article. It's very interesting.
Ooh, I'll definitely be taking a read right after this. Thanks, David. But yeah, just on the topic of like reports and findings in general, I know that zkSecurity was also involved in a zk bugs repository. So like reproducing vulnerabilities or allowing anyone who's viewing looking at the repository to be able to reproduce those vulnerabilities. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the intention with that, maybe its broader implications and just general research in terms of vulnerabilities and maybe some impacts on the education side as well.
Oh yeah. So by the way, this is mostly work from Stefanos and Chen Yang at zkSecurity. And basically what they're doing is that they took, and this is work that started with another paper on basically the taxonomy of zk bugs and how can we have a framework to understand where zk bugs arise and how to find them more efficiently and these kind of things. And so when we looked at the data sets, we realized that it's sort of hard to understand. You know, you want to look at like where bugs were found. So a lot of them are found in reports and these kind of things. And it's kind of hard to understand reports. Reports are not always clear. It's not always clear what the bug really was. And so it all started from there. Like it would be nice to have actual code snippets that we could run and reproduce to really understand what the bug was. And furthermore, once we have that, we can use it for different purposes. So education is one purpose, of course, but you can use it to test tools. Maybe we can write static analysis tools to find these bugs more efficiently. And if we have this set of actual code that we can run, then we can test it and see if it actually works to find real bugs. And I just mentioned using AI to find bugs. These also serve as a good training data set if you want to train an AI, a model to try and find these bugs. So yeah, the project is still ongoing. I know Stefanos and Chen Yang are working on that. So I'm probably not the best person to talk about their latest results, but there should maybe at the time of where this is published, there might be a blog on our blog, a blog post on our blog talking about that. So yeah, check the zkSecurity blog to see the latest results.
Yeah, got it. And just shifting also to some of your other initiatives that you have, I'm very curious to hear about your intention in developing No Name, so a completely new programming language for zk applications. I'm wondering if you could also speak about some of the challenges that exist in other programming languages and maybe some of the enhancements or improvements that No Name implements.
Yeah, so yeah, I guess we have. I mean, so zkSecurity is more of an audit and development. It's a service shop, but we do have like I guess one product. I mean, it's not like you have to pay for it, but you could think of it as a product, which is No Name. It's this open source project that we've been working on. Actually, that's not true. We have other projects, but that's the main one we're currently working on. We also have Wasm Time, Wasm I don't know how to pronounce it, which is a library that you can use to write Wasm in JavaScript. But anyway, so No Name is this zk circuit front end. So you can use that. It's a programming language that you can use to write circuits. It's very similar to Noir, if you know Noir from Aztec. And the reason is that we were basically writing that sort of at the same time. And so great minds collide, or Um, the interesting things is that we sort of influence their language and they influence our language through many discussions that we had with Kev, who was the lead developer at the time for Noir. And so if you know Noir and you don't know No Name, that what I just said helps. If you don't know Noir, you can think of No Name as a very Rust-inspired language, but at the same time, a very Golang-inspired language. So we sort of started that with the idea that people were writing a lot of things using Circum on Ethereum, and Circum is very low level. People write a lot of bugs in Circum just because you can't really create good abstractions in that language. And so we were like, okay, it's not that hard to write a good language. Actually, it turns out it's hard, but that was the thinking at the time. It's not that hard to write a better language. And so we started NoName as this language with types and custom types and a better type system, yet a dumber type system. And so that's where we were more like Golang inspired. And I think that's because I really liked Golang at the time. And I was also working on a OCaml code base, and I really hated OCaml. And so if you know OCaml, it's basically a language when you can, it sort of looks like Python in a way. People are going to get triggered by me saying that. But in Python, you don't write, or like in JavaScript, you don't write types. And so in OCaml, most of the time, you don't write types. It's a typed language. It's a strongly typed language. So you're using types. There's a type system, unlike Python and JavaScript. But the type system infers a lot. So it allows you to write very, very, very generic functions. And they will get basically parameterized when you're using them. And it will figure out what the types actually are. And so coming from languages like Golang, where you have to write your types every time, and the code is always clear because you can really see what are the actual signatures of your functions and your types and so on. I didn't want that. And so NoName makes minimal inference. Like most of the time you have to write the types. Like it won't guess too much about the types you're trying to use. It makes minimal use of generics. And it has what Golang had at the very beginning. It has a poor man, what I call a poor man package manager, which Circum doesn't have, which is basically, you can say you want to use this or this GitHub repository as dependencies, and it will fetch these dependencies for you, but there's no versioning or anything like that, which is not great, but it works, and for now it works, and it allows us to iterate pretty fast, and so that's what we have for now. And the other stuff that we have is that it's compatible with different proof systems and different arithmetizations. And so now it's compatible with Kimchi, which is the proof system of Mina, which is a Plonk proof system. And it's also compatible with R1CS, specifically the R1CS used by Snark.js. And we did that on purpose so that you could use it to deploy on Ethereum very easily. So today you can deploy NoName on Ethereum. There's actually some NoName. There's a Sudoku solver on Ethereum that we deployed as a test. And yeah, that's basically my pitch. Oh, actually, let me say a third thing. I'm sorry for rambling again. But the pitch also include the fact that it's a work in progress language, and we really want that language to be the community language. We want it to be used by many different people for many different reasons. We're not using that for specific gains. We're not monetizing it. It is made by the open source community for the open source community. And so we have a lot of resources to learn how to use it and how to contribute to it. We have we've done some videos on it. We've done some streamings on it where many people join and ask questions. We have a book to learn how to contribute to it. We have many issues that are ranked by level of difficulties on the issue page of GitHub so that people can easily get into it and you can ask questions and we'll answer. We have Telegram group chats and so on. And so today we have like 20 external contributors and many commits that came from the community. And we actually hired a number of people that contributed to these open source projects. So it's also a good way to get noticed if you're looking for a job. And so I would say that today we're not really matching what CIRCOM can provide, unfortunately, but we're very close to have something that can basically do everything CIRCOM can do and more. We're working on it thanks to a grant from the Ethereum Foundation, but it's about to run out. So, it's a passion project, so we're going to keep working on it. But not only we're looking for contributors, but we're also looking for ways to fund the project. And that's my pitch to the world.
Yeah, great. It's very interesting to see your thinking process behind all the design choices that you made as well. And just going into some of the other initiatives that you have, I know you have your own personal blog, your own videos, podcast, even your own book on called Real-World Cryptography, which I find very cool. But it seems like you're also very focused on the education side. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on what you saw as the most impactful resources or tools that were effective in helping developers, users, even the general audience who wants to learn more about zk, get onboarded.
Yeah, I would say, as the tools are getting better, I would hope that you don't really need to learn about zk, because it's just a tool in your toolbox, and you shouldn't have to it shouldn't be a leaky abstraction. You shouldn't have to learn how it works or how to the subtleties of zk in order not to write bugs in your zk applications. And I think the zk VMs are being pretty good at that. But I think it's always going to be a leaky abstraction in the same sense that when you learn a new language, you have to. Languages have lots of leaky abstractions. Like you have to decide if you want to allocate on the stack or on the heap. You have to understand pointers and references and copying and cloning. And there's a lot of things you need to understand because of how machines work. And so I predict that you're always going to have to learn a bit of zk because it's always going to be this leaky abstraction. Like you'll have to understand precompiles, where you need to use precompiles, what precompiles you can create, even if you want, even if you're in the realm of zk VMs. So, yeah, if you're starting today, I'd say maybe try and use zk VMs if you're, just playing around, because that's probably the easiest thing to use. If you're trying to deploy something in production, I don't know. Maybe it's in between the two right now. Maybe if it's a small application, you should aim for using something like CIRCOM or Gnark or ArcWorks or maybe No-Name at some point. Or maybe zk VMs are maybe good enough for a number of applications today. And so maybe that's a good bet. And, as you're digging into different frameworks and trying different things, you might also read some books, like, the documentation of these frameworks, and learn a number of things just by reading the documentation there. If you want to dig more, then we get into the question of a lot of people get very curious about zk. They want to learn more. They want to really dig into it. And they sort of meet a wall, especially if you're not good at math. You often meet that wall pretty early. And so there's different ways to attack it. You can try to find explanations that are more abstract, that are more for the layman. And I think that's a good way. There's a lot you can understand by reading things that spend more time on basics or sort of black box some of the stuff that you don't really need to understand these concepts. And I think Real-World Cryptography, the book I wrote, is one of these things where I was talking to a lot of very frustrated people, that devs and PMs and managers and even security people, that really wanted to understand more about cryptography, but couldn't really understand it because of the amount of mathematics. And so I sort of wrote that as an introduction that doesn't need as much mathematics as any of the other books that I could find on the market at the time, and I believe still today. But if you're really interested, at some point it's good to go back to the basics. And I would say, you'll find interesting stuff on my blog, in books like the shameless plug, Real-World Cryptography. Read it, buy it, read it, whatever. But you find a lot of videos online. You find a lot of good blog posts. They really were spoiled in the ZK community by having a lot of people that care about education. So there's a lot of very good resources, some very good papers. I always recommend reading the Cairo paper from Starkware. Excellent paper about ZK VMs. And that was my own introduction to ZKVM, and I learned a lot through that paper. Not all papers are created equal, and some papers are really hard to read. And I do want to say that sometimes you do need to go back to the basics. So if you're serious about learning cryptography or ZK specifically, you're gonna have to find some real fundamental course on groups and subgroups and rings and fields. So these mathematical constructions that are basically ways to group a bunch of elements together, and you're grouping them together by explaining how you can find these elements and how you can operate on these elements. And a lot of cryptography and ZK is about these groups that you can create. And some are called rings and fields, and they have weird names, extension fields and whatever. But essentially what they are is just rules on how to find these sets of finite sets of elements. There's only a certain number of them, and rules on how to compute with them. And then how can we go from one set of such elements to another set of such elements? What we call isomorphisms or morphisms and so on. Or basically rules on how to travel from one world to another. And once you understand these things, everything else becomes much more approachable. So if you're not good at math, or you think you're not good at math, there's that saying that says that you're only ever 2 weeks away from understanding it. If you really want to understand it, you're only 2 weeks away from understanding it. You just have to take a car or a train and isolate yourself in a forest and just read intensely for 2 weeks about how to create these groups of elements, how to go from one group to the other, and you'll get there. So that's my advice.
Yeah, I got it. And yeah, really appreciate all the strives that you've made to try to make it more accessible. But as you said, hopefully as our tools are getting better, people shouldn't have to learn about all of the intricacies and all the technical details in order to use ZK. It should just be something that, if they want to learn more about that, they should do, but not a requirement. But again, really appreciate all of the strives you made to spread ZK on the educational standpoint and making it more accessible in general. But just as a last question before we end, are there any sort of closing thoughts you have, or anything specific that you really want the audience to take away from?
It's that's so hard to answer, because the audience is I never know who's the audience, especially for a podcast. There's so many different types of people that are listening. I I hope I motivated some people to dig more into the basics with what I just said, and really try to free themselves for 2 weeks to look into these things. we're really lucky to be in this field with breakthroughs happening every year. And I think we're only at the beginning. Like I really think we're creating a toolbox that's going to be useful for not just blockchain, but many types of applications. And so it's a very exciting field to get into. I understand if you're into AI and you want to work in AI, but we also are pretty exciting in the zk world. We also do zkML stuff, so and I'm saying you the listener who is really into AI and trying to decide between zk and AI. And yeah, I would say maybe on this idea of a community, I keep saying that we're spoiled, but not just in terms of resources. Like everybody's very nice in our community, and like I feel like we're lucky to be in this kind of inclusive community where everybody's producing content, everybody's trying to explain things to the other. We have these amazing podcasts, we have these amazing articles that people write. Everybody's sort of contributing in their own way. People are creating courses or books that they're publishing for free. Alessandro Chiesa just published one not too long ago. Justin Tyler has one. Dan Bonnet has one. Like it's crazy how many free resources we have. And yeah, we're a very inclusive community, and I'd say maybe that's my last word. Let's keep trying to be an inclusive and welcoming community, and let's not. It's very different, right? Because we're in the cryptocurrency world, but we've been like sort of shielded away from all the scams and all the craziness and all the projects attacking one another. There's still some drama in zk, but I believe we have minimal drama. And coming from a field of the field of cryptography before cryptocurrency and zk, we had way more drama in cryptography. So yeah, let's keep it this way. Let's all be nice to each other. Let's keep being tolerant and helpful to others, especially new members of the community. And yeah, that's it. What's the saying? Make love, not war, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Love it. Just keeping an inclusive community, keeping it collaborative. And you certainly motivated me to go back and review the basics. If
Nice.
I have the chance, I will take a train and then spend 2 weeks studying. But now I have at least a plan for the weekend. So certainly motivated me, and hopefully other people in the audience are motivated as well. But yeah, overall, thank you so much, David, for all the insights. Really enjoyed today's conversation and hope to see you again soon.
Cool. Same. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much.